This video is brought to you by Brilliant. There's no question that most poorer EU states have benefited from their accession. Hundreds of billions of EU funds have been pumped into these Eastern and Central European countries to help close the economic gap with richer members in the West. On average, their GDP per capita has risen from just below half the level in the EU in 2004 to above 3/4 today. But there have been some systematic shortcomings which have blocked a full economic convergence with their northern, richer counterparts. And in a couple of cases, joining the EU might even have hurt new member states' economies in the long term. So in this video, we're going to have a look at 3 of the potential downsides to joining the EU: brain drain, the euro, and the single market's tendency to actually exacerbate regional inequality. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. First, let's start with brain drain. In short, what we mean here is that while the freedom of movement guaranteed by the EU single market has been great for workers looking for new and better opportunities around the bloc, newer and poorer EU members have often struggled to keep their best and brightest young people. Around 10 million Europeans from Central and Eastern countries have moved to the wealthier capitals of the West, such as France and Germany, the latter of which received over 30% of European working-age migrants by 2021. Increasingly, these intra-European migrant flows are composed of well-educated young people. In 2021, 32% of people who emigrated across the EU had a high level of education compared with 28% in 2016. This flow of well-educated young people to richer countries is known as brain drain, and it's long been an existential crisis for poorer Eastern European member states. For instance, Romania, Bulgaria and the Baltic Three have all seen a fifth of their workers leave since joining the bloc. Croatia, the last country to join the EU in 2013, recorded nearly 4.3 million people living in the small Balkan country in their 2011 census. But by 2021, that number had dropped to about 3.88 million, a 10% decrease in just a decade. According to the EU Statistics Office, 15% of working-age Croats now live in other member states, the second highest proportion after Romania. In practice, this means that these EU countries are spending public money educating their young people, only for them to leave the country once their education is finished. The OECD calculates that Poland's emigrants carry 160 billion euros worth of education embedded in them, and in Romania, with a single doctor's education costing the Romanian state roughly 100,000 euros, the annual loss of doctors alone represents more than a quarter of the money Romania receives from the EU. Conversely, Western European countries get a great deal here, because they get well-educated migrants for free. In fact, according to an analysis from 2018, when you account for these migrants' productivity, the brain drain added 170 billion euros of value to the German economy that year, 141 billion euros to the UK, 54 billion euros to France, 24 billion euros to the Netherlands, 15 billion euros to Sweden, and 11 billion euros to Denmark. The brain drain also exacerbates those countries' demographic crises. In Croatia, for example, where the Prime Minister has described brain drain as an existential threat, the national fertility rate, that is, the average number of babies per woman, has fallen to below 1.5, well below the so-called replacement rate of 2.1. In the Baltic countries, it's even worse. The latest data suggests that Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia all have fertility rates of around 1.3. This means that these countries' populations are already shrinking and aging, which is bad news economically, but this trend is dangerously exacerbated by brain drain. In short, brain drain is both terrible news for economic growth in new member states, and it also exacerbates inequality within the EU. Second, membership of the EU often apparently exacerbates regional inequalities, or at least doesn't do much to improve it. This has been the case across Europe, from Portugal and Spain in the west to Hungary and Bulgaria in the east. Today, as many as 60 million European citizens live in regions where GDP per capita is lower than it was in the year 2000, while a further 75 million reside in places where annual GDP per capita growth has only been marginally above 0% since the turn of the century. and a number of persistently low growth regions exist in southern Europe, as do many low-income regions in Eastern Europe. Now, that's not to say that the EU isn't trying to address the inequalities. Since 1989, €1,040 billion have gone to the EU's cohesion policy, aiming to smooth out these regional inequalities, mostly financing big infrastructure projects like new highways. €392 billion has gone to the current 2021 to 2027 Cohesion Fund, which makes up nearly a third of the entire EU's budget. However, in practice, joining the EU seems to make regional inequality within individual countries worse, often by exacerbating the urban-rural divide. You can see this in this map. In many countries, the capital city has seen impressive growth, but the urban areas around it have stagnated. Eurostat data from 2022 shows that the GDP per capita in most Eastern European capitals now far surpasses the rest of their respective countries' average. For instance, in Romania, Bucharest's GDP per capita is 77% more than the EU's average, whilst the rest of the country lags far behind, around 50% of the average. Some studies suggest that this is because most of the money coming from the EU's Cohesion Fund helps to increase income for high-skilled individuals and higher income households, but with little or no impact on poorer households, which has only worked in widening the income inequality in left-behind regions and encouraging political polarisation. The final possible downside worth mentioning is the euro. We're not going to go into it in too much detail here, but the TLDR is that joining the euro can actually be bad for an economy in the long term. The Eurozone is great in certain respects. It allows new members to borrow at cheaper rates, improves current stability, and lowers trade frictions. However, joining the euro means giving up control of your monetary policy to the European Central Bank, so you can't print your way out of debt crises or choose interest rates to match your economy. And because the euro is essentially quite a strong currency, joining it can undermine competitiveness. Italy is perhaps the best example of this. Since joining the euro in 1999, its GDP has stagnated, and the ECB's monetary policy has never been able to accommodate both a stagnant Italy and a booming Germany. This is perhaps one of the reasons why many member states now prefer to keep their own currencies, even though adopting the euro is technically required by the Maastricht Treaty. Now, to be clear, we're not saying EU membership is necessarily bad at all. New members receive a lot of money, and fiscal and political support is plausibly responsible for many new members' recent economic booms. Rather, the point we're making is EU accession isn't an unalloyed good, and these shortcomings are something aspiring members should be wary of. There's a lot of difficult decisions to make here, and making huge decisions is difficult, even for world leaders. The good thing is that Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data, programming, and AI. Their interactive classes help build your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing. So while you're building real knowledge on specific topics, you'll also be becoming a better thinker. For instance, their Predicting with Probability course can help you better understand and assess the world around you. You can learn to wrangle massive datasets, compare distributions, and master fundamental concepts like Bayes' theorem. That might sound a little technical, but with their active learning, you learn this by answering questions like which airline is least likely to have a delay due to weather, and how much more unruly airline passengers have gotten since the pandemic. Data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating the modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/TLDR, or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.